So we had Linda Lai on the radio. Mark and Linda, of course, had Linda on their show on Saturday morning. And we had Linda on with us yesterday morning for the second hour. I have a scribbled little bio because I forgot to bring her list, but she's a staff attorney for the ACLU. How many people ever met an attorney for the ACLU? Anybody here? Get out. You guys are a little more on the game there. Out of San Francisco, she went to Yale and Berkeley and clerked for Ginsburg, which is interesting. Is she really short? She looks like miniature. Is she like this big? Seriously? Yeah, she looks pretty little. Her area of expertise is free speech and privacy. Obviously, we're fans of that. And 10 years in private practice and 3 years with the ACLU. So she's not new. I had a couple people who had called and said, why is the ACLU coming to our meeting? We don't like them. Okay. I'm paraphrasing and I'm being snarky. But honestly, at the end of the day, the ACLU is going down this, okay, free speech and privacy attorney. I'm thinking, how many times have we needed one of those, right? So we should talk to the people who do this all the time, every day, free speech and privacy. So welcome, Linda. And we'll do Q&A after. I asked her to tell us a little bit about the ACLU, and she's really proficient in the drone issue and some other stuff we care about. And then we'll break the microphones out, and we'll do questions on the sides, okay?
Thank you. Actually,
Thank you very much.
Testing, does this work? If
I can use the thing. I didn't see it.
Okay, great. Maybe let's do this
here.
here.
That little growth you had going on there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. This is not actually my first collaboration with the Tea Party. I had the pleasure of litigating a case with the Tea Party about free speech rights in your public library plaza not so long ago with Tim Pappas, and it was a fabulous collaboration, and I think it just goes to show that issues of free speech and privacy are not partisan issues. They are constitutional issues, and we all care about them. They're rights that belong to all of us, and we can have very fruitful areas for collaboration. And I'm really pleased and excited to be here. It was tons of fun being on the radio show this past weekend and the weekend before, and I look forward to more opportunities to collaborate with the Tea Party as well, because I think we have a lot of issues in common. I was hoping to touch base on sort of 3 main issues tonight. I was invited by Sally to talk about drones. The sort of initial outreach occurred when a few months ago your city council voted to approve a letter of intent to join Ventura County's bid to be one of 6 drone testing sites in the country. So the debate is happening across the country, and it's happening here in Reading as well. So I wanted to touch on 3 main issues. The first is, why should we be worried about drones? I think all of you probably share an intuitive reaction, but I just wanted to articulate, at least from my perspective, some of the concrete reasons why I'm worried about drones. 2, I wanted to provide you some of the legal framework. I'm a lawyer, so I tend to look at things through a legal lens, but just to arm you with information about the legal framework governing drones, or more disturbingly in this case, the lack of a legal framework that governs drones. And the third thing I wanted to talk about was some advocacy that we at the ACLU have done, and how that might point to some advocacy opportunities for you up here in Reading. So turning to why should we be worried about drones? I get this question a lot. What's the difference between a drone and a helicopter or an airplane? Why are you so worried about drones? And I think there are 2 main reasons. They are cost and surreptitiousness. When the law enforcement proponents of drones come forward, they often say, this is so much cheaper than a helicopter. That's actually exactly why I kind of worry about it. When the cost of tailing someone 24/7, monitoring them comprehensively to figure out where they're going, when they're going, with whom they're spending their time, what they're doing, when you can do that only with traditional sort of foot patrols, beat cops, following someone around in a car, that's a lot of resources. And you don't do it unless there's a very, very good reason, unless you have good reason to think that that person is a bad guy. When you dramatically lower the cost of collecting comprehensive information, not just about one person, but 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, you can start doing it, you can start collecting comprehensive information just based on idle curiosity. So in a curious way, the high cost of collecting information in a pre-technological era has been a natural deterrent to abuse. When you lower that cost through advances in technology, you remove the deterrent to abuse, and so that's when we need additional safeguards in place. So cost is a big reason why drones are pose a qualitatively different threat to our privacy than helicopters or airplanes. The second reason is surreptitiousness. Drones come in all sizes. We have predator drones that are huge and loud and no one would mistake them. But we have tiny drones as well, the size of a hummingbird, and that are intended to be surreptitious so that no one will notice it. If I'm enjoying the privacy of my backyard, which has a high 6-foot fence, on a sunny afternoon, I don't actually sunbathe nude, but let's say I did. If I'm enjoying the privacy of my backyard on a sunny afternoon, and a helicopter comes flying overhead, I know that I should grab a robe or duck inside to protect my modesty. But if a tiny little surreptitious hummingbird drone flies by, I don't know that I need to do something to protect my privacy. So cost and surreptitiousness are two reasons why drones are really different from traditional forms of aerial surveillance. And I think a third thing that we have to take into account is drones in the current backdrop of, frankly, what is a very pervasive state of surveillance by the government. We've all been reading about these Snowden revelations, but even setting aside all this sort of recent revelations on the national security stuff, there is a lot of information that's already being collected about us. There are several fusion centers throughout the state and across the country, certainly several in California, that encourage state and local law enforcement to collect information about us. State jurisdictions across the country have automated license plate readers that record vehicles and their license plates as they go through, pass along the streets and roads. These are sold as, oh, we can detect stolen vehicles, or if there's someone that we know has kidnapped someone, we can figure out where they are. But what we've found out from Public Records Act requests is that jurisdictions across the state are collecting ALPR data and sending it to fusion centers, and it's sitting there. So it's not just, oh, there was a stolen vehicle that afternoon, and then we caught the bad guy. They're warehousing this information for months, in some instances, years. A member of the ACLU in San Leandro was this intrepid, great, he's concerned about his privacy rights, and he did a Public Records Act request to his local police department and found out that in 2008 to 2010, they caught his, They caught his vehicle over 100 times, and they actually obliged him to provide the records. And one of the records, there was him and his two very adorable little daughters getting out of the car in their driveway, parked in front of their house. Why is the San Leandro Police Department retaining this data? So if you keep into account the fact that the government is already collecting a fair amount of information about us through closed-circuit television, automated license plate readers, and then you add that drone data, there's a lot of bits. So if it's just the ALPR data in isolation, it's not that much information. But if you add CCTV, you add drones, you add more and more and more, you get a mosaic. You get a very comprehensive picture. So it's not just drones in isolation, it's drones in the context of other forms of information that's being gathered about us. So these are some of the reasons why I'm worried about drones, and the ACLU as an organization is worried about drones. And I think it's often helpful to sort of articulate our first principles. We have a gut reaction, but I think it's always useful to ask why. So that's the answer to my why. In terms of the legal framework, where are we? Congress enacted the FAA Modernization Act, which gave the Federal Aviation Administration a mandate to integrate drones into domestic airspace by 2015. The country is no doubt experiencing what I would have to call drone fever. There is a lot of money in the drone industry. The drone industry claims that it can bring $13.6 billion to the economy between 2015 and 2017. So there are a lot of reasons why all kinds of people are getting excited about drones. There may also be all kinds of beneficial uses. I've heard about, using drones for search and rescue or fighting wildfires. That's obviously a very important topic up here. There may be various forms of agricultural applications that could, reduce pesticide application. There may be beneficial uses. I don't think technology is inherently good or inherently bad. Technology is as good as bad as people. So it can benefit us, but it can also be used to hurt us. And I think our job is to make sure that it is used in a sensible way where we can reap the benefits, not just take in the rhetoric, but ask a lot of questions along the way and make sure that it's used in the service of good things that we care about and that we don't just give the government a blank check. So speaking of blank check, the Constitution, going back to the legal framework, we have obviously the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. I'm a big fan of the Constitution, and my personal legal opinion, unfortunately I'm not a judge, is that that if you apply Fourth Amendment principles to the use of drones, that law enforcement really should be required to get a warrant before it uses a drone. Now that's not where the law is yet. That's where I think the law should be, and I like to think that that's where the law will end up eventually, but we are very far away from that. The key thing to remember with the Constitution is that technology evolves far more rapidly than constitutional law. So the constitutional law is always playing catch-up. GPS devices, they have been in use for decades, but we only got a ruling on the constitutionality of whether the cops can attach a GPS device to a vehicle without a warrant. We only got that ruling from the Supreme Court last year in 2012. And they've been in use for ages before them, with law enforcement saying, we don't need a warrant to attach this, with privacy rights advocates saying, oh, yes, you do. And in the interim, of course, they were just attaching it and using it without a warrant and tracking people. But it took getting up to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court finally to weigh in on that issue. So we cannot just rely on the Constitution to protect us against drones, because we're not going to get a ruling from the Supreme Court on drones for a long time. I think we will eventually get one, but it is years off, possibly a decade and a half or so off. What precedent do we have under the Fourth Amendment? The precedent that I'm sure the government will trot out when it wants to use a drone without a warrant are two cases going back to 1986 that involved traditional forms of aerial surveillance of planes, basically. And the ruling was basically that in both of those cases that it's kind of like an open, a plain view or plain flying view doctrine, that you don't need a warrant to fly over someone's backyard and to surveil it, to take photos. There was one that was a house and one that was a commercial property. Because any old plane could have done that, there's nothing to prohibit people from being in that airspace. So unless the government was using very unusual technology that was not widely commercially available, unless the government was using very unusual technology, no warrant would be required to photograph from a plane from doing a flyover. So given that, I am certain that law enforcement, I mean, they've already been making that argument, that they can use drones without a warrant if they're just flying over. There is a common recognition that if they're using a drone to conduct surveillance, that would allow them to look into your house or into the area immediately surrounding your house. There's a recognition by law enforcement typically that a warrant is required for that situation. But if we're talking about your backyard, even behind a fence, so like say 15 or 20 feet away from the immediate outer walls of your house, the law enforcement position is going to be, of course, we can use a drone to capture all of that information. We don't need a warrant to do that. Certainly anything you do on a public street, but including things in your backyard unless it's right up close to your house or inside your house. That's how law enforcement is interpreting the traditional forms of aerial surveillance the case law to apply to drones. But as I already explained to you, I don't think that's a really good analogy. Drones are very different from traditional forms of aerial surveillance, so the case law isn't that relevant, and I think it's actually quite distinguishable. But that's an issue that's going to have to be sorted out, and it's not resolved by the courts right now. So where does that leave us? It leaves us having to turn to our legislators at all levels, federal, state, and local, and urging them to enact a privacy framework because the Constitution is going to take a lot of time to catch up. There are definitely efforts to do that. There are numerous bills that have been introduced into Congress. The last time I checked, these stats are a little old, about a month old, and the information is changing very quickly. But as of about a month ago, only 7 states had not introduced some form of drone legislation. So states are, the legislators across the country are very interested in this issue. There are 2 bills pending in the state legislature. Neither is great. The ACLU certainly opposes both of them because they don't go far enough. We'll see what happens to that. If we have any legislative updates, I've promised to share them with Sally, and hopefully she can get out the word to you in terms of specific opportunities to call, as Gary encouraged your members of the state legislature about them, because one looks like it's moving forward, and it really doesn't offer enough protections. And what I'm worried about is enacting a bill that sounds like it's protecting privacy where it doesn't really, because that's just the illusion of privacy, and that's actually worse than no bill at all. Because if there's no bill, then we know we need to come back next year and get a good bill. But if there's a crappy bill, excuse my language, it doesn't help us because then we'll just have this meaningless protection in place, and it'll be much harder to enact something more protective. One thing that I find sort of interesting about the legislative front is that one of the issues that we were worried about as an organization, a couple years ago was, what about weaponization? Are these drones, a lot of these drones are manufactured so that they can be outfitted with, weapons. And is that going to be used in domestic drones? The consensus in the state legislation definitely seems to be everyone is including prohibitions by and large against weaponization. So I find that sort of reassuring that the government's not going to use a weaponized drone against me. However, there was an interesting document released about a month ago, Customs and Border Patrol, which has been using drones in theory to police the border. It turns out they've been loaning out their drones to other federal agencies. So they're clearly using them for non-border patrol purposes. And there was also a report from Customs and Border Patrol that had sort of plans for drone usage down the road. That wasn't the precise title, I'm paraphrasing, but that's effectively what it was. And they wanted to put on the table considering weaponization of drones. So I find that a troubling development because I really am already a little concerned about the privacy implications of domestic drone usage, and I'm extremely concerned about domestic drone usage if they're going to be weaponized. So that's sort of the legal framework. I also wanted to talk about advocacy, just to give you a little sort of war story about what the ACLU's been up to on that front, and then also maybe some lessons and opportunities for you folks here in Reading to get engaged as well. So I live in Alameda County, which wanted to, our sheriff announced last fall that he was interested in getting a drone. And that was interesting to me. So I immediately did a Public Records Act request to his office for all of the records and documents that he had about drones. And while in the media, he made it sound like it was a very sort of vague, someday, possibly maybe plan, the records I got back were a little different. It turned out he had already applied to the California Emergency Management Agency, which is the pass-through funding organization for the Department of Homeland Security. He had already applied for and received approval to get CalEMA money to buy a drone. So it sounded like he was actually pretty far down the road. Interestingly, in his grant application, he also said that the purpose of the drone would be intelligence dissemination and gathering. That is a fancy way of saying surveillance, gathering information about people. When we publicized these documents, he immediately said, oh, no, that's not what we meant. We meant that it would be used for after a terrorist event, then we do recovery assessment. It's not actually what the grant application document guidelines say, but maybe that was a mistake in the grant application. So a number of concerned community members, the ACLU, we went to the Board of Supervisors and just went to public comment and say, look, the sheriff has said he wants to get a drone. We're really concerned. This is an important issue. And then the president of the Board of Supervisors, this was in November, said, you know what, this is an important issue. I hear that people are very concerned, and I think the Public Protection Committee of the board should hold a hearing on this. So we thought, great, there will be a hearing, because what should not happen is that we shouldn't be just rushing into the decision, and it shouldn't be a unilateral decision by one person. It should be a more participatory process. It should be a more open process, and our civilian elected leaders on the Board of Supervisors should be overseeing that process. It shouldn't be a unilateral decision by the sheriff. So that was in November, when the president of the Board of Supervisors said there should be a hearing at the Public Protection Committee. And we were all looking forward to having that hearing and presenting information. Then this crazy little thing happened on the December Board of Supervisors agenda. And there were like 66 items with tons of attachments. Well, if you looked at attachment 17 to, Appendix 4 or something like that, there was just this little item for asking the Board of Supervisors to approve the sheriff's receipt of this grant money to buy a drone. So we raised a huge ruckus when we saw that. And by the end of the day, I had a call from County Council saying, sorry, that was a little mistake. We didn't really mean for that to be on the agenda. And the sheriff withdrew it. So we were pleased to accept again his comment that it was a mistake and that there would be a hearing. So then we had a hearing in February, and leading up to that, the sheriff and I had a lot of back and forth. And one thing that I will credit him with, at the beginning of the process, he just wanted to get a drone, and there was no privacy framework in place for what the drone was going to be used for, what's going to happen to the data, a million questions, no answers to any of these. His office set about the hard work of trying to draft a privacy policy. It's not easy. But it's essential, and you need to have that in place before you get a drone, because otherwise it's a blank check. So we had a lot of back and forth. I still don't think his privacy policy went far enough, and frankly, it allowed a lot of the warrantless mass surveillance that he swore up and down in public was not his purpose, but on paper, it sure seemed like it allowed that. We had a very, very boisterous hearing with tons of people testifying, and really, the community got engaged, and the Board of Supervisors really understood that. There wasn't an action item at the time. The sheriff wanted to, it's kind of a little game of chicken. He hasn't said that he needs the Board of Supervisors approval, but he's made clear that he's not going to go forward. He's not going to go forward without more of an endorsement from them. So right now it's in a holding pattern. I was really glad to see that in his budget for the 2013-14 year, there's no money for a drone. And I asked him point blank, does this mean, what's the status? And he said, we're still looking at it. We're working on the privacy policy. When we've, we get further on the privacy policy, then I will revisit the decision. So it's on hold, but it was a tremendous shift from, sneaking it through on this agenda item, this consent item, to actually sitting down and drafting a privacy policy, which needs a lot of work, to saying, I'm not sure what we're doing next. And the reason why we were able to go that far is because of a huge community turnout and a huge public concern about we do not want a blank check. So I think there are a ton of opportunities to get engaged, exactly what Gary was saying about, call your elected leaders, let them know, share your concerns. I think the key fight on drones is actually going to be at the local level. We know how much legislation gets through Congress. A lot gets stalled. So I wouldn't hold my breath to assume that Congress is going to pass a bill that's going to be very, very protective of our privacy on drones. Who knows what's going to happen? Nothing may get through the process. Even if something gets through, it's likely to be quite weak. At the state level, I'm also not optimistic about the two bills. They're not strong enough. They're not where they should be. So what does that mean? It means the key decision makers are at the local levels. Each community gets a choice. Do we want to get a drone? Do we not? And it's your elected leaders who should be held accountable for making that decision. There may be good purposes for a drone, but I think there has to be a really open and transparent debate. Why are we getting a drone? Do we really need it? What are we going to use it for? And what assurances do we have that it's only going to be used for that and not for anything else? These are the key questions that need to be asked. No blank checks. That's just not, that's not the way to, you know, we don't, unless we want to invite the government into surveilling every aspect of our lives, we need to make sure that if any drones are authorized, they cannot be used for warrantless mass surveillance, and that very strong privacy safeguards are in place. Aaron had asked me to talk about some good sources of information. I'd like to direct you to the ACLU website. Our national office has a white paper on drones, which has a really helpful overview and some key recommendations. And also another excellent resource is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They have a lot of information about drones, and they did Freedom of Information Act requests to the FAA for every entity that has requested a certificate of authorization to fly a drone. So they have this fabulous map of the whole country where you can look at, you know, and it's a sort of an interactive thing where you can see all of the jurisdictions that have applied for permission to fly a drone. There are a few in California, no law enforcement. They're mostly federal, no state or local law enforcement. They're mostly federal agencies. I think CAL FIRE had one for a while ago, but so far there's no police department or sheriff's office in California that has their certificate of authorization. So I think that's another great resource to get more information on drones. So that's about it. I'd love to open it up to questions. Yes? The question was, what do I think of Snowden? I am incredibly grateful to Edward Snowden because he has put a lot on the line. He has foregone, you know, amazing opportunities. He could have gone on living his life in Hawaii. He could have sold these secrets for a lot of money, and instead he's, you know, stuck in the in the Moscow airport for goodness knows how long. Because I think he really believes in the principles of our Constitution and that the government was overreaching. You know, personally, I'm worried that Daniel Ellsberg will be one of the last great whistleblowers who isn't really hounded by the government. You know, we've seen a rise in prosecutions of whistleblowers, and that's troubling. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question. Where is these drones being
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
My fault, sorry.
What we'll do on the questions, if you want to ask a question, you can just line up along the side over here or over there, and we'll have the mics for you. Or we'll bring it to you, either way.
Okay, I'll ask the first question. I first want to say thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And I wanted to tell everybody that tomorrow morning, Linda is going to be speaking during the 3-minute comment period at the Board of Supervisors. So what I've done is I put together some petition. If you didn't sign it when you came in, this asks the Board of Supervisors to keep these issues that Linda has talked about tonight in mind, because if the Reading Airport does get picked to be a drone port, we want to have these guidelines in place before they get here. So I'm going to pass these petitions around, sign them, and I will take them to the Board of Supervisors and City Council tomorrow and tomorrow night and give them to our officials.
If there's just one thing I could add, first, you know, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, really happy to be here, and I had a fabulous time on the radio show this past Sunday and then the prior Saturday. And I think one thing that's been fascinating to me in terms of working on drones is that this is an issue that captures everyone's imagination across the political spectrum. It's not a partisan issue. It's a privacy issue. It's a rights issue. And I think there are fantastic opportunities for us to collaborate. And I'm really excited to be able to collaborate with you on this. And I hope that there are other issues we can collaborate on as well.
Hi, Linda. I'm Mark, Sovereign Mind Radio. We haven't met yet.
Nice to meet you.
In person. I wanted to ask you what you think about, I mean, my opinion is that our government is so far out of control right now with the rules and the laws and the regulations. I mean, you look at the NDA and the Patriot Act and what they've done. I mean, legally right now, they could actually have a manned drone kill someone on American soil with no repercussions. And so I would like to see you guys maybe start taking on those kind of issues if possible in the future because I mean, I could give example after example of them not paying to the Constitution, you know, attention to the Constitution.
Right.
So I'd kind of like to get your take on that as far as, you know, we talked about it on the radio with the filibuster with Rand Paul and what that was all about. But they do legally, I'm assuming, I'm sure that from what my understanding is that they can actually kill Americans on American soil now with a manned drone or an unmanned drone. What's your opinion on that?
So two things. One, the hearing that you're referring to where Senator Paul was questioning Attorney General Holder was very troubling because it took Holder, Senator Paul was asking exactly that question. So is it your position, given that the U.S. has used targeted drone strikes to kill Americans abroad, is it the government's position that they could do the same in the U.S. without due process? And Holder hedged and hedged and hedged and hedged. He did eventually say, no, we would not be able to do that. I find it troubling that it took him so long to spit out a very simple one-syllable answer, but eventually he did get there. Whether we can rely on what government officials say to Congress is a little questionable. We have seen Clapper, the head of the NSA, lie bald-faced to Congress. So, I don't, yeah.
But is it in the rules for them the power to do that? Do we know if that's a fact or not? Because he said no, they wouldn't or couldn't, but that's just him saying it. That doesn't.
So the question is it in the rules that the government could just kill an American on American soil with a drone in a targeted killing? So part of the problem with a lot of the national security issues and the amazing sort of power grab that we've seen in the last 12 years is that a lot of it is secret law, and we don't have access to it. Now, if there's anything that should not be secret, it's what the laws are. So Congress passes these statutes, but then the government interprets them. You know, a statute is often quite broad, and there's wiggle room for interpretation. Sometimes it's reasonable interpretation, sometimes it's a totally wacky interpretation that everyone would disagree with. But what we've seen with the Snowden revelations is that the government has been consistently interpreting the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to be much broader than anyone would think it really is. But all of these opinions are secret, so we don't have access to them. In terms of your earlier question about you'd like to see the ACLU do something about this, we've been trying. There are a lot of doctrines, however, that make it very difficult to bring challenges to national security issues. There's two main doctrines that basically keep people, that shut the courthouse doors. One is called the standing doctrine, that you have to show that you were actually injured. And if you're challenging a spying program, it's often hard to prove that you were really spied on. There are very few people that have that sort of concrete evidence. We had a case that went up to the Supreme Court this past year where we had a pretty good, it was much more likely than not that our clients were spied on, but it wasn't definitive proof sufficient for the Supreme Court, so we couldn't even bring our case. There's another doctrine called the state secrets doctrine, that if the subject matter of the lawsuit or the evidence that it would take for the government or the plaintiff to prove the case is a matter of a subject of state secret, then you're out of court. You just can't do it. So we had a case where there were a number of people who were part of, and I always find this kind of euphemism ridiculous, but the extraordinary rendition program, where people were just plucked up and taken to Egypt and other places and tortured for months. Extreme, painful, lasting physical and psychological effects. We had individuals who were tortured. They were the subject. There was no doubt, there was nothing speculative that they had been actually injured. The government said, you can't litigate this case because everything about that program is a state secret. And the courts agreed.
I'll talk to you later in another private call because I need to talk to you about a couple
Linda, we talk about Snowden and the information that the NSA is collecting here in our government. What has happened is the NSA has taken stealing our government to a new level, a state of the art, because it didn't start in 2001. It actually started back in the early 90s. And there was two email programs, one Carnivore and the other one Echelon. And they were watching our emails and also picking up different buzzwords on our telephone calls. They've been doing it for years. But it's just that Mr. Snowden came public with it, and now we know what they've been doing for a long time. But Linda, one thing I want to mention, and you and I talked earlier, and I told you about the number 11 on our agenda. Mm-hmm. Tomorrow night, I will be asking the council to make an agendized issue that the city council take up the issue of drones and drone security, drone directives, or however you want to word it. The city of Reading would have something on file as far as the use of drones. So we can, within the next couple of months or next few weeks, we'll have an issue that we're going to bring this forward and start talking about. So this will be another time that you folks can come out and let your voice be heard.
I have a question. Who manufactures the drones? Is that a secret thing? And is there any way that we can stop and mob the building and get rid of these people?
There are a number.
Attack watch. He just used the word mob.
The government seems to be controlling everybody and everything, and it all boils down to money and control. And if you can get rid of the drones and the manufacturers, you won't have the problems.
Yeah. There are a number of companies, they're both, I've seen Canadian companies, US companies, they're, companies from all over the world. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, there are a lot of drones made in the US.
Lovely. Hey, First Amendment thing, I was curious. What about all these different protests and things like that? And, we've got the tear gas and the riot gear, and we talked to you about it a little bit on the radio yesterday, but the militarization of the police and all these SWAT things and all that. And just for those of you who didn't listen, we talked to two different people. We talked to Stephen Greenhut, and then we talked to Linda after that, and both said, well, the minute they get that kind of gear, they want to go use it. Point to think about. But I was curious if you gave that any other thought.
I think the First Amendment issues are fascinating, and I have to say that I think there are conceptual differences between private drone usage and public drone usage, and the main difference is the First Amendment. So if I'm a television news station and there's a big protest, and all of a sudden the cops with their SWAT teams and their riot gear are coming in and lobbing tear gas at peaceful protesters, I want a nice aerial view of that. That is a media-worthy First Amendment issue of public importance, and I think the media has a First Amendment right to photograph that. On the other hand, if there's a peaceful protest and the government is out there surveilling, either with a CCTV or a drone or something else, and they're capturing and recording, okay, well now I know that Aaron and Linda and Gary and Terry were at that protest, and then it goes in the file. What's that about? Why is that information being recorded? And what kind of chilling effect does it have on us? So the government recording information about what we do, even when we're in public, has an implication on how we exercise our First Amendment rights, because some people are new to protest. They're a little bit timid. They want to go, but not if their name's going to end up in a government file. So that's going to chill some people. At the same time, when a private person is out there recording, they see some newsworthy issue on the public street, there is a First Amendment right to photograph that, to record it. So it's complex. again, I don't think we can have, I mean, the ACLU, and certainly I don't have a blanket rule, drones are good, drones are bad. Really depends on for what purpose.
What about the police? We're always seeing these YouTube videos of people filming the police.
Yes.
And so what's happening, where do you see that going? Because they're getting, I mean, they're kind of getting their bell rung. You know, turn off that camera. No, I don't want to. Yeah, do it. No, I don't want to.
Absolutely. I think, you know, the portability of cameras now, so many people have smartphones with cameras or feature phones with cameras. That has really radically changed, you know, police accountability issues. You know, we have, you know, Rodney King in the early 90s was one of the first instances where police brutality was just, you know, caught on video. And at the time, I remember thinking, you know, because like a VHS video recorder was like this huge thing. Like, who on earth would happen to like have one and run out into the street? But they did, and that was a very historic moment. Now, everyone has a phone in their, you know, or just about everyone has a phone, a very portable phone, and it's really changing how the police behave. What we have been seeing across the country is police arresting people who photograph the police making an arrest. And saying that they were somehow interfering with the police's exercise of their law enforcement duties. And we've seen this happen. I can imagine a plausible situation when someone's interfering with an arrest, right? Like they're getting in there and messing with the cops. But you know, we've seen numerous cases, including a case where the ACLU represented a young lawyer, actually a young law student in Boston, and he was not, I mean, he was not in the melee. He was away from it, but photographing it. And he, you know, he photographed the cops acting inappropriately. So they came over and arrested him for interfering with the arrest. So we won that case, but because he had a First Amendment right to do that.
She shut me off, silly woman. Anyway, my question or statement is: we've been inundated with satellite photos for years. You know, Google and Google Earth, you can see almost anything in your backyard. Mm-hmm. So where does the ACLU stand on positioning those for interference and First Amendment?
Right. So again, we were chatting about that. This is a great question. So again, I think there are a couple things. One, there's a difference in my mind between private recording of information and the government recording of information, because you know, Google has First Amendment rights to record that, and there are, you know, there's a lot of value and benefit from that. Separately, the government, of course, does not have a First Amendment right. Private people do. Secondly, it's less intrusive than comprehensive surveillance. It's usually these are frozen still images. They're not sort of real-time ongoing. Often what we see, you know, for Street View or what have you, is, you know, there's sort of snapshots in time. It's not ongoing constant recording. If it were, I think that would be much more troubling. And third, as I was mentioning also on the radio, there have been instances where Google has been sued for Street View because of the amount of information. There were some instances when they picked up people's like Wi-Fi passwords and their email traffic. I don't think they intended to, and they certainly regretted it when they did because they got in a lot of legal trouble. So one, it's different. Two, it's slightly less intrusive. But three, they can still get sued for it.
Linda? Yeah, I've got a question. We keep talking about the drones being in private companies. The thing is that those private companies are going to contract their product out for the usage for somebody else.
Or the NSA is just going to
There you go. And so what you have is you have 80% of that use is probably going to be used by the government in one way, shape, or form, whether it be local government, law enforcement, federal government, state government, et cetera. The challenge with that is when you have a business and you have 80% of your business going toward one particular customer, you no longer have a customer, you have a partner.
Right.
Because that's who's controlling the money as far as your company goes. And that's one of the concerns that I think a lot of us have. It's whose hands they're in.
Yeah. That's an excellent question. I wish I had a perfect solution to that. The legal limitations we have are that the Constitution, except for the 13th Amendment prohibition against slavery, the Constitution only restricts the government from doing certain things. It doesn't extend to private actors. So we can't import these First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, for the free speech privacy principles to the private actors. But I absolutely agree with you that we cannot just rest on the distinction and assume that it's a sufficient safeguard of our privacy, that it's different between a public and a private entity. Now, for the time being, I am more concerned on an immediate short-term basis, I am more concerned about law enforcement having a drone than a private entity because the cops can show up on my doorstep and haul me off to jail and arrest me. Private entities can't do that. But you're absolutely right that long-term, we still need to be worried about this because if it's in the hands of a private entity, then the government can get it too. They can just sort of launder the request, as it were, through the private entity and kind of contract it out. And we've seen that with the NSA, right? Like with the PRISM program, or with the AT&T, the call records, they are commandeering private resources to get a ton of information about us. So, the issues of free speech and privacy on the internet are enormous. They're very complicated because it's all of these private entities that restrict what we say on Facebook, that collect our data and tons of information about us from our Gmail accounts. And right now it's being used against us for like marketing and annoying things. But it could also be used for troubling things if the government has access to it.
Well, mostly government, because when you stop and think about what the private sector is going to do, I don't think that I'm going to tell Sal I'm going to run out and buy a new drone to make sure the sprinklers are on in the morning when I'm not awake to watch over that. I mean, what private use would it have? So if you're a drone company, the smart money is to go ahead and have your product used by someone who has usage for it, that's going to pay you for it, that's going to use a lot of your time, because that's what you're selling basically is a data informational program.
A vacuum cleaner,
And so that's where I think a lot of our fear is that the government is going to be that 80% holder of the usage of this particular product.
Yeah, I share that concern. I think that's right on.
Hello, I'm Jeff Foster. I have a question and a statement. I've actually have a family member that was in the CIA before Obama took office, and he left because of Obama coming into office. And thank you for that. But he got another job offer. He looked for work, and the government offered him a job in the NSA. So he took the job not knowing what it was or not knowing what he was getting into. He said that it's the biggest government agency in all of them, bigger than the FBI, bigger than the CIA, bigger than all of them. It's the biggest. Most of the government employees are hired there to the NSA because it's the biggest.
Are his initials ES?
No. No. He also told me that he could look up any of my phone calls. He said, I've actually looked up some of your phone calls. You called your girlfriend. You called this or that. You text messaged her. He said, I also looked up your Facebook accounts. I actually worked for Interstate Batteries 2 years ago. And in Prineville, Oregon, they have this big, huge Facebook center. And I went in, and there was a section that was a classified section. You couldn't go in. It was top secret. There was a government agent sitting there saying, oh, I go, what was in there? He goes, oh, it's none of your business. It's nothing. But it was flagged off, and they were storing people's Facebook accounts in the section of the Facebook center. And they're also building out there in Prineville, Oregon, which is smaller than Cottonwood, California. It's really small, a satellite data collection center for the CIA. So I think this is a startling thing. That's just another statement I have. What do you think about the Manning, of the reporter Manning, who was...
Bradley Manning? Bradley Manning,
yes, that was killed in a fiery car accident, and he was on reporting onto the government. Oh, was it Hastings? Oh, Hastings. I get confused. But Hastings, that was killed in Los Angeles in a fiery car accident. And he was also onto the government's tail about this spying and other things with Petraeus going on. What do you think was the implications of that accident and supposed accidental death?
I definitely don't have enough information about that to sort of speculate about the concerns, but I certainly do think it's clear that there are a lot of people that have information that, if released, the public would be very upset about, and that would pose a real threat to the government's ability to continue doing what it's doing. So that's why someone like Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden, you know, I think a lot of us in this room are very grateful to them for shining the light, sharing important information about what our government is doing with our information, and the government doesn't want us to hear it because it's so insane that we wouldn't support it. But they're doing it anyway.
Yeah, well, that's all I had to say about the NSA thing. When I found out the information on it, it's really staggering. They get to know everything you're doing, and when my cousin showed me the information of everything that I was doing on the internet, it was startling. So people need to be aware of what's going on with surveillance of they're taking away your Fourth Amendment right, your First Amendment right, everything, and people need to be on top of it. It's we the people that need to stop it. And one person can change something, but it takes a whole group of people to get that change and the restoration we need to get our country back on the right path and the constitutionality of our country back to where it needs to be. And that's all I have to say.
Thanks.
Who says our young people don't know anything? Good for you. Okay, so
Great.
more people who know more stuff is safer than a few people who know a lot
Absolutely.
at the end of the day.
Yeah. Great.
So if we all pay attention, they can't get everybody. How's my theory? Does that hold up?
Good. Sounds good.
It's always been my theory. There just needs to be more of us, that's all. We have another quick question, and I wanted to let people know, Kelly and April, are you having your food preparedness breakout? They are tonight, okay. So last question, and then you guys can, we'll force Linda to stay here and still talk to us, but for people who have breakouts, and Religious Liberties is meeting this evening across the way in the classroom in one of the school buildings. So Marla's doing that. Mark, are you guys having survival and preparedness? No, not doing that tonight. So we have food prep meeting in the fellowship hall and Religious Liberties. And one more question.
Yes, ma'am, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My question is, there's no limitation on how small they can send a drone, excuse me, or into, you know, your privacy?
So in terms of what the Fourth Amendment would prohibit under even existing doctrine, which I think is not protective enough, but the government would need a warrant to have a drone sort of hover at the window and look inside. And it would need a warrant to sort of surveil the areas in what's called the curtilage. It's the area immediately surrounding the house. Even under the existing traditional manned aerial surveillance cases, they would need a warrant for that. What they would not need a warrant for is your backyard, your private property behind a fence, but say like, 10 feet away from the edge of your house. They could have a drone surveil that, and if you mechanically apply the existing Fourth Amendment doctrine, you would say, oh, we don't need a drone for that. I don't know that that's where the courts will ultimately end up, but that's how law enforcement is interpreting the traditional aerial surveillance cases into the context of drones.
Okay, so when I'm sunbathing and a helicopter flies over, a helicopter flies over, I can scurry inside and not be seen.
Exactly.
But a drone, if it's fairly silent and maybe the size of a pigeon, I wouldn't even know it was there.
Exactly, exactly. And the technology is advancing rapidly. They already have drones that are, the size of a hummingbird. And the technology is advancing in such amazing ways that they're outfitting the drones with all kinds of different kinds of recording equipment. So we have thermal imaging devices that can effectively see through walls, right? They can see the heat on the inside.
Right.
We have this kind of like swarm technology where if you can send out a multitude of drones and then they all pick up the information and then you aggregate that. And then you can apply sort of high-level analytics to the information that's collected, match that with facial recognition, behavioral analysis. There's something called gait analysis, G-A-I-T, so they can recognize the way you walk. And so there are all kinds of ways that they can, there's some manufacturers, I think their claims are often overstated, but they claim that they can sort of predict behavior. So like if they're monitoring a crowd, they can tell that that person's going to do something bad because they're like behaving in a shifty way. But often these analytics purveyors really overstate what they can do. So they're boasting to the government, oh yeah, we can help you pick out the terrorist in a crowd of 1,000, but whether they can actually do that is really much more questionable. However, the government is clearly applying very advanced analytics software to this comprehensive data that's
But
being
one
collected.
thing we know is that we can trust our government.
It's my mother, even my
Thank
mother
you.
doesn't think they're here to help anymore. Okay, I guess we have another one. Hold on.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, you can tell that I'm really in sympathizing with Edward Snowden. He's out there all alone,
Yeah.
and he doesn't know how many people are really behind him. And I don't know how we could get our voices to him since he is in Russia, but it would be nice if everybody en masse got behind this young man, because if not for him, we wouldn't know what we know now. And there are other people out there that are probably afraid because they're all alone also, and they won't let their voices be heard either if we don't stand up and say something.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I agree.
I'm just dying to know how long it's going to take for somebody to develop something like the bubble, you know, some kind of bubble you can, you know how we have wireless and it has a sphere,
Oh,
that,
yeah.
you know, that broadcasts. I wonder how long there'll be before you can buy something that you put in your house that breaks the signal of all this kind of stuff, you know.
I think in the
Could somebody get on that? Let's get somebody on that. What about that nice young man? Where is he? Okay, Linda, you are awesome. We really appreciate
Thank
it.
you
We'd
so
love to have you
much.
back. What are you doing next week?
Thank you very much. I really thank you.